My name is Bethany Cruz. I am 38 years old. I was standing in the fellowship hall of Abundant Grace Church on a Saturday afternoon in March, holding a paper cup of lukewarm coffee and trying not to check my phone when a man I had never seen before stood up from a table on the other side of the room, knocked his folding chair back with his legs, and walked straight toward me with his eyes already wet. I did not know his name. I did not recognize his face. I had never shaken his hand or sat across a table from him or passed him in a hallway. I had never seen him at all. But when he was close enough that I could see the scar along his jawline and the way his mouth was working like he was trying to get ahead of his own voice, he stopped walking and said, "That voice. I know that voice." And then he pulled me into a hug so tight that my paper cup crumpled and the coffee ran down the side of my wrist and dripped onto the linoleum floor. And he said into my shoulder, "You kept him from pulling the trigger. 4 hours and 22 minutes, and you never stopped talking." He was crying by the time he finished saying it. The whole room had gone very quiet. My cousin Marcella was standing 6 feet away, still holding her own coffee cup, and for the first time in the 38 years I had known her, she did not say a single word. She had said plenty 3 months before that at the Cruz family Christmas dinner, in front of 20 people, with a smile on her face, like she was doing me a favor. I need to go back to the beginning. Not because the beginning explains everything, but because it explains Marcella. And it explains why her voice that December night landed the way it did, and why I stood there in the fellowship hall that March afternoon wanting to be anywhere else in the world, and how a man I had never met ended up being the one to say what I had been waiting my whole life for someone to say. The Cruz family is loud by design. My grandmother, Esperanza Cruz, came to the United States from Oaxaca with $4, a suitcase held shut with a belt, and an opinion about everything. She raised 5 children in a 2-bedroom apartment in the east side of a city that did not make things easy for her, and she kept all 5 of them fed and clothed and in school by being the loudest person in every room she entered. She believed that if you were quiet, you were either afraid or you were hiding something. She believed that the world only noticed the people who made themselves impossible to ignore. She passed this belief down to her children like a genetic trait. My mother, Rosa, inherited it in full. My Aunt Carmen inherited it doubled. My Uncle Hector could silence a restaurant by clearing his throat. I was the quiet one. Not shy. Quiet is different from shy. Shy means you want to speak and you can't. Quiet means you're watching. I watched everything when I was a child. I watched how people held their shoulders when they were lying. I watched how my grandmother's voice dropped 2 full registers when she was actually angry, compared to when she was performing anger for the room. I watched my Uncle Hector make promises he had no intention of keeping, and I noticed the exact way he held his coffee cup differently when he was sincere versus when he was performing sincerity. I did not share these observations. I tucked them away. My family decided that this made me odd. Marcella was the opposite of odd. Marcella Cruz was 43 years old that December, and she had spent every one of those years perfecting the art of being noticed. She was 4 years older than me, and from the time I was old enough to attend family events, I understood that there was a specific hierarchy at Cruz gatherings, and Marcella sat at the top of it. She was beautiful in a way that announced itself, with long dark hair and a laugh that filled rooms before she did, and she knew which stories to tell and exactly when to tell them. She sold real estate, and she was good at it, and she had 12,000 followers on Instagram, and a white SUV that she washed every Saturday, and a husband named Brandon who laughed at everything she said. My grandmother loved her best, and everyone knew it, and nobody held it against her, because it seemed like the natural order of things. I became a crisis negotiator. Specifically, I spent 8 years working for the Special Operations Division of the County Police Department in the Crisis Intervention and Negotiation Unit. Before that, I spent 4 years as a patrol officer, and before that, I spent 2 years finishing a degree in psychology at the State University, where I learned enough about how human minds work under pressure to understand that I already knew most of it. I had been watching people under pressure my entire life. The degree just gave me the language. My mother described my job to people the way you'd describe a job you don't quite understand but don't want to seem uninformed about. She would say, "Bethany works with the police in a special unit, crisis intervention. She helps people in difficult situations. If someone pressed her, she would say something about talking people through problems. The way she said it made it sound like I worked the helpline. Made it sound like I sat at a desk with a headset and talked people through their feelings. My grandmother, before she passed, used to introduce me at family events by saying my Bethany is the peacemaker, which was technically true but made me sound like I ran a mediation center for divorcing couples. I never corrected them. This is important to understand. I never offered more information than was asked for, because I learned early that the people who were supposed to know what I did either already knew or didn't want to know. You cannot make someone curious about your life. You can only answer the questions they had to ask first. There is a particular loneliness in being good at something invisible, not a dramatic loneliness, not the kind that requires attention or sympathy, just a low and consistent awareness that the work you do well is work that disappears the moment it succeeds. When a hostage negotiation resolves without injury, there is no visible evidence of what happened. There is no damage to assess. There is only the ordinary world continuing, people going home to their families, a 19-year-old getting into a police car instead of a coroner's van, a teacher going home to see his daughter on weekends. The success of the work is its invisibility, but that means the people who love you never see the work. They see you come home tired, they see you go quiet at dinner, they see you drive around the city at 10 at night with the windows cracked, and they decide you are simply a person who needs space. And they let you have the space, and the space is real and necessary, and also a kind of distance that accumulates over time into something that starts to feel like being unseen. Nobody asked. My colleagues at the unit called me the monk. Not to my face, mostly. Drea told me about it, which is what partners do. They tell you the things you're supposed to know, but wouldn't hear otherwise. The monk. Because I could sit on a call for 9 hours and never once sound like I was running out of patience or energy or presence. They meant it as a compliment. I accepted it as a fact about how I am built. Some people are not built to sustain the particular stillness that crisis work requires. That is not a character flaw. It is just a shape that some people have and others don't. I have it. I have always had it, even before I knew what to call it or what it was for. In 8 years with the unit, I had been the primary negotiator in 19 active crisis situations. 15 of those involved someone holding at least one other person against their will with a weapon. 4 involved individuals threatening harm to themselves in places that required containment. Of the 19, 17 resolved without a single shot fired. 1 required tactical intervention. In 1, a man was killed, not by law enforcement, but by his own hand, in a way that no amount of talking was ever going to prevent. And I know this to be true because I have been told it by 3 separate behavioral science consultants. And I have also told it to myself in the dark every night for 2 years, and I'm still not entirely sure I believe it. That one sits differently than the others. It always will. The tinnitus in my left ear started after the Kessler Street incident in 2022, when a flashbang deployed closer to my position than it was supposed to. The ringing never fully went away. I wear a small hearing aid now, a beige device that sits inside the canal and is nearly invisible unless you're looking for it. I'm not self-conscious about it exactly, I just don't talk about it. It's one more thing on a list of things I don't talk about. I also have lower back pain that starts in the left lumbar region and wraps around the hip on bad days. This comes from years of wearing a tactical vest for 12 and 14 and once 17 hours straight. I take ibuprofen in the morning the way other people take vitamins. I drive a 2015 Chevy Silverado that has a crack in the dashboard and a passenger seat that won't fully recline and 147,000 miles on it, and my partner Drea has been telling me to replace it for 2 years. I keep saying I will, I won't. Drea Maldonado came into my life 6 years ago when she was assigned to the unit as my tactical partner. She blew out her knee in 2023, chasing a suspect up a fire escape she had no business climbing, and now she runs administrative operations for the division, which means she answers phones and completes paperwork at a desk and has significantly more energy for everything outside of work than I do, because sitting at a desk does not drain a person the way 27 hours of active crisis response does. Drea is 36 years old and 5 feet 2 inches tall, and she has never once in her life arrived anywhere without bringing something for you, even though nobody told her to bring something. She shows up with the right coffee, in the right size, at the right moment. She showed up at the hospital after Kessler Street with a turkey sandwich and a magazine about true crime, which she said was the only magazine in the gift shop that didn't have a crossword. I've known Drea long enough that I believe this was true. Drea Maldonado came into my life 6 years ago when she was assigned to the unit as my tactical partner. She blew out her knee in 2023, chasing a suspect up a fire escape she had no business climbing. And now she runs administrative operations for the division, which means she answers phones and completes paperwork at a desk and has significantly more energy for everything outside of work than I do, because sitting at a desk does not drain a person the way 27 hours of active crisis response does. Drea is 36 years old and 5 feet 2 inches tall. And she has never once in her life arrived anywhere without bringing something for you, even though nobody told her to bring something. She shows up with the right coffee in the right size at the right moment. She showed up at the hospital after Kessler Street with a turkey sandwich and a magazine about true crime, which she said was the only magazine in the gift shop that didn't have a crossword. I've known Drea long enough that I believe this was true. Drea is also the only person in my life who has ever asked me what the calls are like without flinching at the answer. She asked me once, about 2 years into our partnership, when we were sitting in a unit vehicle outside a laundromat at 2 a.m, waiting for a situation to stabilize on the floor above us. She said, "What does it feel like when you're in it? Like actually in it, not the procedural part, the other part." I told her about the quality of attention it requires, about how time works differently when you're in the middle of a call, how an hour can compress into what feels like 7 minutes, and also expand into something that feels like a week. I told her about the specific silence in yourself that you have to find and hold before you say anything, because if you don't have the silence in yourself first, the other person hears the absence of it in your voice. She listened, and then she said, "That sounds like an extremely weird form of meditation." I said, "It is." She said, "You're good at it." I said, "I know." She said, "That's not bragging, by the way. That's just accurate." It was one of the more important conversations of my professional life, and it happened in a unit vehicle outside a laundromat at 2 a.m, which is how the important conversations usually go. The Christmas dinner was the Cruz family's annual gathering at Aunt Carmen's house in the north end of the city. Aunt Carmen's house has 14 chairs in the dining room and 12 in the living room. And every year the table seats all of them because my family is not the kind of family that uses the word capacity as a limiting factor. There was a honey glazed ham and 2 kinds of rice, and my mother's tamales, which she starts making on December 21st and considers her primary contribution to the continued existence of the family. My Uncle Hector brought a store-bought pie and nobody said anything. Marcella brought a charcuterie board with 6 different kinds of cheese and prosciutto she had ordered online, and she posted a photograph of it on Instagram before anyone touched it. I sat at the end of the table, closest to the kitchen, because I like to be near a door. This is professional habit. I always sit with sight lines clear and an exit accessible. At family dinners, it looks like I prefer the far end of the table. It's a reasonable misunderstanding. We were somewhere between the main course and the pie when Marcella's husband Brandon asked me how work was going. Brandon asks this at every gathering. He asks everyone how work is going in the way that some men cycle through safe questions to avoid silence. He is harmless and well-meaning and completely uninterested in the actual answer. I said work was busy. I said something about a long week. I said the unit had been stretched thin because the department was short-staffed the way every department in the state had been short-staffed since 2020, and I was picking up additional calls, and that was normal for this time of year. Brandon nodded and looked at his plate. Marcella, who was sitting 3 chairs down, said it without looking up from her food. She just set it into the middle of the table like it was a reasonable observation. She said, "It's kind of funny when you think about it. Bethany talks for a living." She said it lightly. She said it the way you describe someone who teaches kindergarten or reads bedtime stories professionally. Like the activity itself required no explanation because it was self-evident and uncomplicated. Talks for a living. Like it was something a cheerful person did. There were about 8 conversations happening across the table at any given moment. The remark landed in a small pocket of silence between conversations, which meant more people heard it than Marcella probably intended. My mother looked up from her tamale. My Aunt Carmen laughed softly, the way she does when something is both true and slightly awkward. 2 of my cousins on the other side of the table kept eating. One of my younger cousins, Valeria, who was 17 and the only one who ever seemed actually curious about anything, looked at me to see how I would respond. I said, "That's about right." Because what was I going to say? You cannot explain, in the middle of a Christmas dinner over honey-glazed ham, what it actually means to negotiate with a man who has a gun pressed to someone else's head. You cannot describe what it takes to find the exact tone and the exact words and the exact rhythm of sentences that will make a frightened, cornered, desperate person feel heard enough to pause before they do something they cannot take back. You cannot explain that the silence you leave in a conversation is sometimes more important than the words, and that knowing when to be quiet is its own form of expertise, and that there is a version of this work that looks, from the outside, exactly like talking, and another version that is nothing at all like talking, and that you have spent 12 years learning the difference. and that the difference has mattered on 17 separate occasions to people who are still alive and would not be if the difference had not mattered. You cannot explain this over tamales. So I said, that's about right, and I had more rice. But it saddened me. That is the honest answer. I drove home that night and I sat in the Silverado in my driveway for a few minutes before I went inside, and I let it sit. Talks for a living, said it with a smile, said it like she was summarizing something obvious. I had been in that family for 38 years. I had sat at those tables for 38 years. I had done this work for 12 years. And not once, not at a single Christmas dinner or Easter gathering or birthday party or summer cookout, had anyone asked me what the work actually was. Not in a real way. They asked if it was dangerous, and I said not really, and they believed me because they wanted to. They asked if I liked it, and I said yes, and they moved on. Nobody had ever asked what I did on the nights I couldn't come to the thing they had invited me to. Nobody had asked what happens after. Nobody asked what I carry. They saw a quiet woman who worked with the police in some unspecified role involving communication, and they decided that was enough information, and Marcella had just given them a cleaner sentence for it. She talks for a living. It had the feeling of a phrase that would follow me from that dinner forward. It did. January brought a cold snap that buried the city under 8 inches of snow and froze the pipes in the unit's training facility and made everything feel worse than it probably was. I worked a call in the second week of January that lasted 11 hours and required me to be on the phone with a man who had barricaded himself in his brother's house with his 3-year-old daughter and a shotgun he had, purchased legally 6 days before, and said he was going to use. I will not share specifics of that call because I never do. What I will tell you is that the call ended without the shotgun being used, and that the little girl was eating breakfast the next morning. That matters more than any other fact about January. But I went home after and slept for 13 hours and woke up with my lower back completely locked up, and I took 2 ibuprofen and lay on my kitchen floor for 20 minutes because the cold linoleum helped, and I looked up at the ceiling and thought about Marcella saying she talks for a living, and something in me shifted. Not broke, shifted. Like a weight that had been sitting in one position for a long time and found itself an inch to the left. My mother called me on a Thursday night in January. She calls every Thursday at 7:15, which is after her telenovela and before she starts worrying about whether she remembered to take her blood pressure medication. She asked how work was, and I said fine. She asked if I was eating, and I said yes. Then she said, Marcella said to say hello. I said that was nice. My mother said, she asked about you. She's always asking about you. I know what Marcella asking about me looks like. It looks like Marcella finding openings in conversations to redirect attention to herself by positioning me as a point of comparison. Oh, Bethany, yes, she does the crisis things with the police. She talks people down from things. She's always been so patient. We can't all be talkers. We can't all have the gift. Said in a tone that implies patience is a lesser trait than performance. Said in a way that sounds like a compliment until you're driving home. I said I knew. My mother said, she might be right that it's a gift. All that talking. I don't know how you do it. There it was. My mother had absorbed the sentence. She talks for a living. It had migrated from Marcella's mouth to my mother's. And now it lived there the same way. Comfortably. Without malice. Without understanding. I said good night. I said I'd talk to her Thursday. I drove a lot in February. This is my version of processing things. I get in the Silverado and I drive around the city at hours when the traffic is thin enough that driving doesn't require active attention. I drink bad gas station coffee, and I take routes I know well enough that my hands can run them and my mind can do whatever it needs to do. Drea knows about this habit. She does not share it. She processes by talking to people, which is why she has more friends than I do. Drea called me on a Tuesday night in February at 10:30, which meant she was still at the office, which meant something had happened. She said, your Aunt Carmen is a member of Abundant Grace Church. I said I knew that. Aunt Carmen had joined maybe 3 years ago. She went every Sunday and brought my mother about once a month. Drea said, they're doing a community luncheon, second Saturday in March. Your aunt put your name in as someone who might say a few words about crisis intervention and community resources. I said I wasn't sure about that. Drea said, she already told the event coordinator your name. I said, that sounded like Aunt Carmen. Drea said, Marcella's gonna be there. Carmen invited her because Marcella does charitable work. She said charitable work with the specific flatness she uses when she is reading something from a text message without editorializing. I said, charitable work. Drea said, she donates to a food bank. She also posts about it. I said I didn't want to do the luncheon. Drea said, I know. I said, I don't do public speaking. Drea said, you talk professionally for a living. I said, don't start. She said, I'm not starting. I'm reminding you that standing in front of a church fellowship hall and saying 3 sentences about what crisis negotiators do is approximately 1% of what you do for actual work. I said, it's different. She said, it really isn't. It really was. I can spend 4 hours on the phone with a man who is holding a shotgun in his brother's house and not feel the specific anxiety I feel when I'm asked to stand in front of an audience of people who are safe and comfortable and waiting to hear something inspiring. With a shotgun man, I have a job. I have a task. I have something to do that matters in a measurable and immediate way. In a church fellowship hall, I am just a person standing there, being looked at. Those are completely different things. But I said yes. I said yes because my Aunt Carmen had already said yes on my behalf, and because you don't call your Aunt Carmen and tell her you won't do the thing she already promised you'd do. That's not how Cruz family dynamics operate. The week before the luncheon, my mother called me on Thursday and mentioned that Marcella was planning to make her famous caprese skewers for the potluck portion of the event. My mother said Marcella was also going to share a few words about her charitable contributions and the importance of giving back to the community. She said this cheerfully. She did not appear to notice that she was describing the two of us in the same sentence, as if our roles at this event were equivalent. I said that sounded great. I said my back was acting up and I needed to go. The Thursday night before the luncheon, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my standard 12-ounce mug of black coffee and a folder of community resource handouts that the department's outreach coordinator had prepared for me, and my phone buzzed with a text from Marcella. The text said, heard you're speaking at Carmen's church thing. That's so sweet. You're going to be great. Is it more like a panel thing or do you actually present? Just curious about the format so I know how to introduce you if it comes up, LOL. I read it 3 times. I am not quick to attribute malice. This is a professional habit. When you spend your career talking to people at the worst moments of their lives, you learn that most harmful things people say come from fear rather than cruelty. Marcella's text could have been genuine curiosity. It could have been social awkwardness with a lull tacked on to smooth it over. It could have been exactly what it looked like, which was a woman who had decided that talking for a living was a charming enough characterization that she could use it as an introduction. I texted back, no need to introduce me, I'll just be there. She sent back a heart emoji. I put my phone face down on the table and looked at the resource handouts and drank my coffee. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. The kind of March cold that doesn't apologize for not being winter anymore. I put on slacks and a blouse and my good gray blazer and my flat shoes because I've learned that heels are a comfort trade-off I am unwilling to make on days when I'm already going to be anxious. I drove to the church, which was 18 minutes from my apartment, and I found the parking lot and pulled into a space and turned off the engine. I sat there for 9 minutes. I know it was 9 minutes because I watched the clock on the dash. I was not having a crisis. I want to be clear about that. I was not frightened or overwhelmed. I was doing the thing I do before difficult situations, which is sitting with the discomfort until it finds a shape I can work with. I do this in parking lots. I do it before calls. I once did it in a hardware store parking lot before going in to buy a new set of kitchen knives because I had decided to stop using the old set and I had to sit with that decision for a minute before I acted on it. It's just how I work. What I was sitting with that morning was the specific combination of Marcella's text and my mother's cheerful equalization and the Christmas dinner sentence and 11 hours on the phone with a man and a shotgun and the cold kitchen floor and the fact that I was about to stand up in front of a room of people and describe my work. And I had absolutely no expectation that they would understand it. And I didn't know how to do this thing without feeling like I was either oversharing or understating. And both of those felt wrong. My phone rang. It was Drea. I answered. She said, I'm in the parking lot. I said, what parking lot? She said, the church parking lot. I can see your truck from here. Pull out of that space and look left. I looked left. Her car was parked 2 rows over. She was leaning against the driver's side door, holding 2 large paper cups from the good coffee place that was out of my way and had apparently not been out of her way. I said, you didn't have to come. She said, I know. I came anyway. Get out of your truck. I got out of my truck. She handed me the coffee. It was the right order without her asking. She had been getting my coffee order right for 6 years. She said, you look fine. The blazer is good. Your back? I said my back was okay. She said, you're going to say 5 sentences, answer 2 questions from a very nice congregation, and then you're going to eat potluck food and come home. That's the event. I said, Marcella's going to be there. Drea said, I know. I'm also going to be there. Those cancel each other out. We went inside. The Fellowship Hall of Abundant Grace Church is a large, bright room with cream-colored walls and round tables covered in yellow tablecloths and folding chairs pushed in at angles the way folding chairs always are before people start adjusting them for comfort. There was a potluck table against one wall that was already filling up with covered dishes and a small podium near the front and a banner that said Community Together that had been attached to the wall with painter's tape that was starting to come loose at one corner. It smelled like coffee and something with garlic. My Aunt Carmen found me immediately and hugged me and told me I looked beautiful and took my arm and began steering me toward the podium area to introduce me to the event coordinator, a woman named Patricia who had short silver hair and a clipboard and the organized energy of someone who has run 100 of these events and will run 100 more. Patricia shook my hand and said they were so glad to have me, and she asked if I had any materials, and I handed her the resource handout folder, and she said perfect. She said I'd have about 8 minutes after the opening remarks, just a brief overview of what my unit does and what resources are available, and then open it up for a couple of questions if people had them. 8 minutes. I could do 8 minutes. I saw Marcella across the room talking to a woman I didn't recognize, gesturing with the hand that wasn't holding her coffee in a way that meant she was describing something she found interesting. She was wearing a red dress. She looked, as she always looked, like she had dressed for a magazine. She saw me from across the room and waved with her whole hand and smiled the smile she saves for rooms that contain people who don't know her yet. I waved back. Drea appeared at my elbow with a small plate of what turned out to be crackers and hummus she had found at the potluck table before anyone told her she couldn't. She said, "Caprese skewers are still covered. My guess is she's waiting until there are more people." I said, "That's probably right." The room filled up over the next 20 minutes. The congregation of Abundant Grace was smaller than I'd expected, but denser in feeling, the kind of group where people had known each other for years and the conversations happened with the ease of familiarity. I noticed several people I didn't recognize and a few faces I did, from the neighborhood where my Aunt Carmen lived. I found a spot along the back wall where I could stand with sightlines to the room and a clear path to the door and held my coffee and waited. And that is when I saw him. He was sitting at a table near the left side of the room, roughly 30 feet away. He was maybe 50, maybe 52. A broad-shouldered man with a close-cropped haircut going gray at the temples and a plaid shirt and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He was sitting with a woman who appeared to be his wife and another couple across from them, and they were in the easy conversation of people who have known each other long enough to fill silence comfortably. He had a scar along his jawline. I noticed the scar the way I notice most things, without knowing yet what I was noticing. Patricia came to the podium and welcomed everyone and gave thanks and said a few words about the theme of the event, which was about community connection and the people who work to keep communities safe. She introduced me. She said my name and said I was a crisis negotiation specialist with the county police department with 12 years of service, and she asked me to come up and share a few words. I went to the podium. I said something about crisis intervention. I said something about the resources available in the county. I said that the unit's job was to make contact with people in acute distress and try to find a way to keep everyone safe while more permanent help was arranged. I said that most of what the unit did never made the news because the best outcome was the quiet one. I said the crisis hotline number. I said that community members could call a non-emergency line for a wellness check if they were worried about someone. I said a few things about what to do if you witness someone in distress. I was on the backside of 7 minutes. I said I was happy to take a couple of questions. A woman near the front asked how you trained for something like that. I gave the standard answer about behavioral science and communication psychology and field experience. I did not mention the part where you practice in low-stakes situations until your nervous system learns to stay level in high-stakes ones, and then you go into the field and discover that no practice environment is the same as a real call, and so you also practice by doing, and each call teaches you something the previous one didn't. And after 12 years, you have a kind of knowledge that lives in your body more than your mind, that activates before conscious thought catches up. A man near the middle asked if it was dangerous. I gave the standard answer, which is that the unit's job is specifically to reduce danger by controlling the communication, and that our goal is a situation where nobody has to be in danger. I did not say that there are situations where I have been in the same building as an armed individual and felt the particular atmosphere of a place where something irreversible could happen, and that I have learned to function in that atmosphere the way a person learns to function in extreme weather, not by ignoring it, but by knowing it well enough that it doesn't override your judgment. Patricia thanked me, and there was applause, the kind that is warm but not extended. The kind that means people appreciated you rather than were riveted by you. I came down from the podium. I found Drea near the potluck table. She had uncovered the caprese skewers because she said they were just sitting there. I picked up a caprese skewer and turned around. The man in the plaid shirt was standing up. He was not standing to leave. He was standing the way a person stands when something has happened that has overridden whatever they were planning to do next. He was standing with his hands at his sides and his glasses still pushed up on his forehead. And he was looking directly at me with an expression I have seen before only in very specific circumstances. I have seen it at the end of long calls. I have seen it at the moment when someone who has been holding themselves together in a crisis realizes that it's over, that they can stop holding. It is the expression of a person being released from something. He took 1 step, 2 steps. He walked around the table and between 2 other tables and across the yellow linoleum floor. And the room was still in the way. Rooms become still when something is happening that nobody can identify yet, but everyone can feel. He stopped when he was about 3 feet from me and he said, "That's your voice." I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "That voice. I've been listening to it for 18 months. I hear it when I'm trying to sleep." He stopped. He said, "I don't mean that as a bad thing. I mean it the way you hear something that stayed with you, something that mattered." I did not know what he meant. I want to be honest about this. I was not being modest. I genuinely did not yet know who he was. He said, "North Side Community Recreation Center. January of 2023. I was in the utility closet. Marcus Webb. I'm a teacher." And then I knew. Marcus Webb. January of 2023. I had been the primary negotiator on that call. A 19-year-old named Devonte Harris had attempted to rob the Northside Community Recreation Center on a Tuesday afternoon and had backed himself into a utility closet with 2 hostages, one of whom was a coordinator named Jenna Parrish, and the other of whom was a man she had described as a volunteer, a history teacher who had been helping set up a youth program. Devonte Harris had a semi-automatic handgun that he held at different positions throughout the call, depending on how afraid he was. I had been on the phone with him for 4 hours and 22 minutes. Marcus Webb said, "I could hear your voice through the phone. He had it on speaker for a while because his hands were shaking. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. I just listened to you." I said, "Mr. Webb." He said he was going to pull the trigger. There were at least 3 moments, maybe 4, where he was going to do it. I could feel it. And then your voice would change and he would stop. You'd say something, and the way you said it would make him stop. I don't even know what you said most of the time. It was the way you said it. It was calm. It wasn't fake calm. It was real calm. Like you were telling him the truth, and the truth happened to be calming. He stopped talking because he was crying. He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "Don't be." He pulled me into a hug. He hugged me the way people hug when they have been waiting for a long time to do something they didn't think they'd ever get to do. Arms tight and for longer than a social hug, and with the kind of weight that means something is being set down. My paper cup crumpled. The coffee went down my wrist and onto the floor. I did not notice either thing until afterward. He said into my shoulder, "You kept him from pulling that trigger. 4 hours and 22 minutes, and you never stopped talking." The fellowship hall of Abundant Grace Church was completely silent. I am experienced at being in silence. I am experienced at letting silence exist without rushing to fill it. I held on to Marcus Webb for the 5 seconds that the hug lasted. And when we stepped back, I saw the room. I saw Patricia with the clipboard pressed to her chest. I saw the woman who had asked how you trained for something like that, and her hand was over her mouth. I saw my Aunt Carmen with her eyes bright and her hands clasped in front of her, and next to her was my mother, who was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face in 38 years. Not exactly. There was something in it that was seeing, really seeing, in a way that is different from looking. And I saw Marcella. Marcella was standing where she had been standing when I first walked to the potluck table, about 8 feet from the podium area. She was still holding her coffee cup. Her mouth was slightly open, not open wide, just slightly. The way a person's mouth opens when their brain is processing something faster than their face can manage. The red dress, the long dark hair, the Instagram composure. She was not saying anything. Marcus Webb turned to the room, not because anyone prompted him to, but because some part of him needed the room to understand what had just happened. He said, "I'm sorry. I don't mean to make this the thing." He said, "My wife and I have been members here for 2 years. I had no idea this woman was going to be here today. I heard her speak and I knew the voice immediately. I would know it anywhere." Someone at a table near the front said, "What happened?" Marcus took a breath. He said, January 2023. I was volunteering at the Northside Recreation Center, helping set up a youth mentorship program. A young man came in and things went wrong. He ended up in a utility closet with me and another person and a gun. The police came and then this woman came. He looked at me. He said, on the phone. You came on the phone. I said, that's right. He said, for 4 hours and 22 minutes. She talked to him. I don't know everything she said. I know she never raised her voice. I know there were times where she went quiet, and the quiet was the right choice too. I know that at some point he started calling her by his older sister's name, and she just went with it. She just answered to it. And I watched him put the gun down on the shelf next to a box of pool chemicals, and I watched his shoulders drop, and I thought, that woman just talked a 19-year-old boy out of a decision he couldn't undo. The room was still very quiet. Marcus said, I have a daughter. She was 12 at the time. She's 14 now. She visits me every other weekend. He stopped. I got to keep doing that because of this woman. He looked at me. He said, I never met you. I just heard your voice, but I want you to know what it meant, what it still means. I said, thank you for telling me. He nodded. His wife had come to stand beside him, and she put her hand on his arm, the way people do when they want to anchor someone they love back to the ground. The room exhaled. Patricia said something appropriate about gratitude and community and the work of first responders, and then she suggested that people help themselves to the potluck table, and the sound of chairs and plates and conversation slowly rebuilt itself, the way sound always returns to a room after something quiet and true has been said in it. Drea appeared at my elbow. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, how's your wrist? I looked down. The coffee had dried into a brown streak. I said, it's fine. She said, I'm gonna get you a paper towel. She went to get a paper towel. I stood there for a moment. My lower back was aching the way it does when I've been standing on linoleum for a while. My left ear had the faint ring it always has. I was holding a crumpled paper cup, and I had a coffee stain on my wrist, and I was standing in a church fellowship hall in my good gray blazer and my flat shoes, and Marcus Webb was sitting back at his table with his wife and his friends, and he looked lighter than he had when I walked in. I don't know exactly what I felt. I want to be accurate here because I think accuracy matters more than a tidy description. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was something quieter than either of those words. Something closer to the feeling of a weight being set down in the right place. Not removed, just placed where it belongs. My mother found me about 10 minutes later. The potluck was in full swing and people were talking in groups and someone had found music from somewhere. Nothing loud, just background, and the yellow tablecloths and the cream walls and the smell of garlic and coffee had reasserted themselves as the primary sensory facts of the room. My mother walked up to me with a small plate of tamales she had brought herself, because of course she had, and she set the plate down on the table next to me and she said, Bethany. I said, hi, Mom. She said, that man, I said, his name is Marcus Webb. She said, he has a daughter. I said, he does. She said, and his daughter's 14. I said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. My mother, who inherited her mother's belief that silence means you are either afraid or hiding something, was quiet. She was looking at the tablecloth. Then she said, I didn't know what you did. I thought I knew, but I didn't know. I said, I know. She said, why didn't you tell me? This is the question that people always want answered in these moments. And the honest answer is more complicated than the moment allows for. So I gave her the piece of it that was truest and most immediate. I said, you never asked. She looked up at me. She said, I'm asking now. I said, okay. She said, tell me about the calls. Not all of them. One. Tell me one. I thought about Marcus Webb in a utility closet next to a box of pool chemicals, listening to a voice he couldn't see, counting on the voice to hold something in place. I thought about the 19-year-old on the other end, how afraid he was, how the fear had compressed into something dangerous because he didn't know another shape for it. I thought about 4 hours and 22 minutes. I thought about the moment I heard him put the gun on the shelf, the sound of metal on concrete, which is a very specific sound, and how I had kept talking even after that, because the call wasn't over until it was over. I told my mother about January of 2023. I told her what I could tell her. Not everything. You never tell everything. But enough. Enough that when I finished, she was very still, and she reached over and put her hand over mine on the table, and she said, you were there that whole time. I said, yes. She said, and he put the gun down. I said, he did. She said, because of you. I said, because we found a way to talk to each other. She squeezed my hand. She said, that's not the same as just talking. I said, no, it's not. We sat there for a moment with our hands together on the yellow tablecloth, which was slightly askew because someone had bumped the table, and the music was still playing softly somewhere behind us. The conversation with Marcella happened in the parking lot. I had gone outside to get some air, which is something I do after sustained social situations, the way other people drink a glass of water. I was standing near the Silverado with my blazer off, draped over my arm, because the March afternoon had turned mild, and I was watching the light come through the trees at the edge of the parking lot. I heard her heels on the asphalt before I heard her voice. She said, hey. I said, hey. She came to stand about 4 feet away. She had her arms crossed, not defensively, just the way a person crosses their arms when they're not sure where to put their hands. She said, I didn't know. I said, I know. She said, the Christmas thing, the talking comment. I didn't mean it the way it landed. I said, I know. She said, but it still landed that way. I said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Marcella, being quiet in a parking lot, was something I had never witnessed before. She was looking at the same trees I'd been looking at. She said, that man cried. I said, yes? She said, because of your voice. I said, because his daughter has a father. She took a slow breath. She said, I've been telling people for years that you do something with the police. Some communication thing, crisis counseling, something like that. She stopped. I had no idea that you were the thing standing between someone and a decision they couldn't take back. I didn't say anything. She said, I'm sorry I made it small. I looked at her. My cousin with the 12,000 followers and the white SUV and the perfect cheese board, who was afraid in ways she would never say out loud, who needed rooms to notice her because something in her core believed that without the room's attention she would disappear, who had spent 43 years being loud because she did not trust the alternative. I understood her more in that moment than I had in the previous 3 decades combined. I also understood that her apology was real, in the way that apologies are real when they cost something. I said, I know you didn't mean to. She said, that's not the same as it being okay. I said, no, but it's a start. We stood there in the March afternoon for another minute, not comfortable and not uncomfortable, just present. Then she said, your blazer's really nice, by the way. I said, I know. She almost smiled. It was different from her usual smile. It was smaller and less performed. And for a second she looked her actual age and something close to ordinary, and I found that I liked her better that way. She went back inside. I put my blazer back on. Drea came out a few minutes later with the rest of my coffee, which she had apparently transferred to a fresh cup, and she stood next to me and said, how'd that go? I said, better than expected. She said, that's your favorite outcome. I said, it is. We stood there for a minute. The trees were doing the early March thing, where the light is cold but the air is warming, and the two things haven't quite reconciled yet. Drea said, you know Marcus Webb is going to tell that story for the rest of his life. I said, I know. She said, his daughter is going to know it. I said, that's good. She said, you're not going to be weird about this. I said, I'm definitely going to be slightly weird about it. She said, acceptable. I drove home with my windows down a little, even though it was not quite warm enough for windows down, because I wanted the air. My lower back ached. My ear was ringing its usual faint ring. I had a coffee stain on my wrist that had been there since a man I had never met hugged me in front of a room full of people and said I had kept him alive with nothing but the sound of my voice. I thought about what Devonte Harris had sounded like at the beginning of that call, when his fear was everything and the gun was the only shape the fear knew how to take. I thought about 4 hours and 22 minutes of finding the exact word and the exact pause and the exact amount of silence that a frightened 19-year-old needed to hear in order to keep making choices. I thought about how none of that looks, from the outside, like anything. It looks like a woman on a phone. It looks like a conversation. From the outside, it looks like exactly what Marcella said. She talks for a living. From the inside, it is the work of holding a person's life in the space between your words. I got home and put on comfortable clothes and heated up leftover soup and sat at my kitchen table and did not turn on the television. I just sat with the soup and the quiet, which is what I do when I need to settle something in myself before I carry it forward. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother. It said, I told your grandmother about you once. She said you were the quiet one. She meant it like a small thing. I don't think it was a small thing. I put my phone down on the table. I looked at the kitchen window, which showed the dark of the evening and my own faint reflection, and I sat with that for a while. My grandmother was wrong about one thing, not about everything. She was right that the world notices the people who make themselves impossible to ignore. But she was wrong that impossible to ignore is the only thing worth being. There is another kind of presence in a room, a presence that doesn't announce itself, that moves through silence like it was built for silence, that does its work in the space between the words, where everything that matters actually happens. The loudest person in the room is always the easiest to track. But the person holding the phone in the utility closet, the person whose voice reaches through a speaker into a 19-year-old's fear and says, I'm here, I'm listening, I'm not leaving, I'm not afraid of you. Say what you need to say, I'll still be here when you're done. That person changes what happens next. That person doesn't always get to know it. I got to know it on a Saturday afternoon in March in the fellowship hall of Abundant Grace Church, standing next to a potluck table with a coffee stain on my wrist, when a man who had been listening to my voice for 18 months through a speaker on a phone in a utility closet walked across a yellow linoleum floor and said, "That's your voice," and held on. I'll take that. The most powerful things we do are often invisible to the people who love us. And sometimes the most important conversation of someone's life is one where they never see your face. That is not a small thing. That has never been a small thing.